Welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to discuss how I painted this painting right here and how to build the painting, the composition, the lighting, negative spaces, all that kind of stuff. If you're new here, my name is Brett Tadlock, or T an Artist just about everywhere online. My goal here is to simplify digital painting processes and teach people how to use traditional techniques to create really great works of art. So make sure to like the video, subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and share it with others if you get something out of it. It helps the channel grow, and I greatly appreciate it. Oh, one last thing. You can find the longer paint-along version of this video and a whole lot more in my Patreon group. But for now, let's roll that intro. So step one for this painting was drawing out the line drawing for the lion. And then from there, taking the cloud brush that I have, the Impressionistic cloud brush, which you can get all those on Gumroad, and smearing together the different browns and yellows to get kind of a feel for what I wanted for his skin. Put that on a separate layer. Then on a layer, again, I started laying in some quick sky color because I wanted just a simple sky in the background that, you know, it's just there, so it's nothing really important. Then taking that same brown on a new layer, can start just blocking in the colors. It doesn't matter. This brush that I'm using right here is very rough. It just gives that kind of rough edge, but it does give a good underpainting for how I want it to look and how I want to read. So that's one of the key things next is lay in your major sections of color and do it on separate layers. I try to paint in like 2 or 3 layers, but this one I did about, well, I did a layer for the sky, a layer for the rocks, a layer for the tree, a layer for the ground, and a layer for the lion itself. So that's about 5, 6 layers. That way I can build it up as it's going through. But that's one of the key things you want to start with is block in your main colors, your main highlights, your main areas of where it's going to be, so that way you have a good roadmap. Now the line drawing that I have here is really just that. It's a roadmap. So not overly worried about trying to stay in it per se, like a coloring book, but really trying to get those main areas of shadows and lights, so that way if I remove the lines I can still see where the lion is and kind of go through it. Lion and line are kind of hard to go back and forth on. Anyway, so that's what I'm doing here is switching back and forth on these and using some of the different brushes that I have made. I've got like an acrylic dry brush, I've got a impressionistic cloud brush, and several others that I use throughout this painting and switch back and forth. You can use ArtRage's regular brushes like their canvas brush and some of those other ones if you want. You don't have to use mine. I just like mine because every brush that I have and every stencil that I've made has really been designed to help save time. And so it gets a nice effect and cuts down on the having to try and create set effects. And so that's why I've designed them. Now, one of the key things here that I'm doing now is that I've got the major colors blocked in, is that I'm trying to block in where some of the negative spaces will be for shadows and things like the mane, and get those laid in, and then start trying to get it kind of smudged into transition from light to dark and push those and get those lights and darks in there so I know where my midtones need to land at. And so that's the next step you want to do is start blocking in your darks and start blocking in some of your lights. Now you're not trying to go to your darkest dark and you're not trying to go to your lightest light. You're just trying to step that value up a little bit or step it down a little bit, so that way you can really, again, know where you're going with this and what direction you need. So that's some of the main things you want to start with for that is kind of getting it laid out. Then once I've got that, that's where I'm going to start going into the details and starting with the background, moving my way forward. The clouds I'm not going to worry about. The sky I'm not going to worry about. I've got that laid in there, but I'm going to take this rock stencil that I have and start using the marker tool to kind of do some subtle highlights and stuff. And this right here, again, this is underpainting still. So all of this is still underpainting and laying it in. And it's really, again, just trying to get that clear path figured out of where I want to go. And once I get it to kind of where I like it and I can see what direction I want to take it, I tend to switch over to my everlasting oil brush and then use that to really smear it in, because I think that gives the best look for doing some of these rocks. It gives you just that real nice, for lack of a better word, juicy look of oils. One of the other things I'm doing right here too is that I'm breaking up these rock shapes, because my rocks started having that real pattern to it, like it was one rock, one rock, one rock. And so you got to be careful for that, because as humans we love repeating patterns. We love finding a pattern and repeating it, and we do it subconsciously. And so that's what I'm doing right here, is just really kind of breaking up the shape of the rocks, the positioning of the rocks, and then laying in the highlights and everything else. Again, not trying to go for the finished one yet. I'm just trying to get those nice midtones and darks set in for the underpainting, so I can see how it lays out on the painting itself and make sure I'm getting some good contrasts between lights and darks and getting it set up. So that's what I'm doing here. Now right here, this part is looking at the composition, and this is all laid out on my Patreon page. So I was discussing composition for that as I went back in to start laying out some of these more highlights and shadows and stuff. So, and then of course going into the little rock in the foreground there, don't want to forget that guy, and getting that set up, and so that everything there is done as well. And then next, moving forward to the grass. Now the grass, I wanted to have kind of a dirt grass kind of thing, so I'm using my pebble stencil that I made, and it lets me really kind of lay these in quickly and get it, you know, figured out where I want. And then from there I can lay in some of the different tones for the dirt to kind of break up the pattern. And that's just a watercolor background stencil that I made from painted some watercolors on paper and then turned it into a stencil. And so here I'm combining some of my layers together, so that way, and changing the order so I can really kind of play around with it. And so I put the grass layer on top and then cutting out my rock below it. So again, one of the things you want to do is play around with the positioning of the layers. That's the nice thing about digital painting, is that you can still use all these traditional techniques, but you can then move stuff around and reposition it. Now right here, what I'm doing is I'm using some of the preset brushes and talking about those on how to use them in ArtRage. But I don't like to use their like preset grass brushes too much, because to me it looks too repetitive and it looks too stamped. So I'll sometimes lay those down just for a little bottom texture, and then I'll go in and do it over top. Now this is a great way to make pebbles and add some of that extra effects and looks of it. Normally I would do this with a toothbrush. If I was using acrylic or oil, usually acrylic, I would flick paint on there with a toothbrush and then come back in and add some shadows and some highlights to it to make them turn into little pebbles that are now sitting on top of the dirt that is going to be kind of pushed back into the background as I lay grass on top of it. So again, it's all about building those layers, all about adding the extra stuff here in the background to give your eye some understanding of what's going on and where you see stuff. From there, one of the next things is to move to the tree and adding texture. With the stencils, one of the things I like about stencils, again, they're time-saving devices that I've created, but you can use any of them. That's my watercolor stencil. I have tree stencils where I can just grab a part of it and use it. I have a bark stencil where I can use some of the texture from that. That's actually like an oak tree that I painted with a palette knife and stuff, and then turned it into a stencil. So there's a lot of different ways you can get these stencils and use them, but I've got them all set up, again, for the top ones that I think work great for it. But as you can see, it lays in some really nice texture, and then from there you can just take the everlasting oil brush and paint over top of it to get that more finished type look. So now the next step is to really start pulling in on the lion himself. I do have a short fur brush that I've made that I'm going to be uploading to the Gumroad products for the people that have bought them. And here, it wasn't working too great on this one because it kept hesitating with the recording software. So I switched back to just my regular brushes instead. But it does work great for doing hair and like the short hair you'd see on a dog or on a lion. Not so much the mane, but that kind of stuff. So I was trying to see if I could figure out, can I get this to look right? Can I not? And I finally just said, you know what, I'm wasting too much time on it. So I just erased it and then started back over with it and repositioning some of the things. So one of the things I will tell you with this, you may be like me, you may not. when I'm painting animals or trying to get a likeness, there is always a stage in it where I feel like I've just messed it up. I've totally just lost it, and it's kind of spun away from me. That's going to happen every time. And I have learned to realize, you know what? This is really going to happen. I just need to accept it and then push past it. And that's one of the amazing things about digital, is that if I don't like something, I can just undo it, or I can erase it and just as easily as needed, and then paint over it and refine it. So that's what I did here, because the face and stuff, I was sitting here working on it and trying to get it to look right, and make sure that I had the line of the face on the lion, like the skull and everything else kind of established for where all the stuff would sit. And so I was really trying to hone in on that and paint that and get it figured out. But there was a time here, and that's why I spent so much right here on this. I kind of get lost in the details trying to refine it instead of doing what I normally do, which is paint big and loose, zoomed out and try and get it. But I was zoomed in too much here and painting on that. So that can happen. So if you find yourself getting lost in the details, you're spending a lot of time in one area of a painting, step back from it, take a break, and then come back to it. And that's what I did. I realized I was doing that, so I stepped back and I said, okay, let me zoom out. Let me start painting some of the negative spaces for where that fur is folding in on itself, and it's got some stuff there. And that helped me start refining this down to what I liked with it and to what I did. So that's the next step, is try to make sure that you're looking at the bigger picture and that you're adding in those highlights and those shadows and stuff like that. Now, one thing with this right here that I did, that I realized as I'm watching the speed painting, was that I kind of jumped to some of the highlights, the orangish highlights, a little too fast, so there's a little too much of a jump there. I did go back and fix it, but I should have kind of built that up more gradually and done it there. But it's a process. So, but by moving around all over the painting, you can see I'm working the body, I'm working the mane, I'm working the face, I'm working the paws. By doing that, it really gives me the chance to see the painting overall, and that helps me refine it and define it better. And then some of the stuff I did need to zoom in, like on the whiskers and all that, to get those laid out so they would look right. Their face is kind of interesting with those whiskers, because that cheek right there where the whiskers are at is oval, and it's kind of a bulging oval. And so the line of the dots for where the whiskers come out really kind of makes a football shape, so, and or a rugby ball shape, if you know that one better than American football. So, but it's, again, by zooming out and using it and looking at it, I can see that. So this, I turned to the chalk tool because I wanted to get some rougher lines in with it and have it kind of blend in. So what I'm doing is I'm selecting the local color and then blending the lines on top of the lion, so that it gives that real good gradation from the bright orange and the darker browns and stuff, and it really just kind of starts pulling it together. And that's what I'm doing here, is trying to get those details, not overly details, not getting lost in the details, but again, enough texture and everything else to start pulling those colors together and working on those medium tones, those higher tones, and those lower tones to really find the blend of all those. And then from there, I'm also pushing some of the smoothing some of it out, so that I don't have as many brush strokes in it, and it gives it a little bit more refined type look. And so this is kind of the part where you start putting the icing on the cake, if you will. You start looking for ways, how can I pull this in, how can I adjust this? Sometimes you'll do it and you don't like it, so you undo it. Sometimes you do it and you're like, yep, this is what I want. And so that's what I'm doing here. Now this right here is another one of my brushes that I'm using to paint in these grasses. And then what I do is I take the soft eraser and erase the bottoms of them so they kind of fade back into it. And that's done, the best way to do that is to really grab some of the local color and streak it up out of itself. And it builds it up that way. And then just go back and soften it and paint over top of it and build more and more and more. You're not having to paint every single little bit, but because you've got that mottled paint underneath it, you've got those pebbles underneath it, you've got these streaks, you've got some of that other stuff. It gives you all of that really kind of thing. So what I did here was I merged everything down to one layer. I created two new layers. I created a highlight layer with an overlay layer, and I created a multiply layer for shadows. And that's what I'm doing right here, is laying in the highlights for where I want the sun to really come across it and the grass and everything else, and then taking the palette knife and going back and softening it and lowering the layer opacity so it's a little bit of a more soft but yet distinct highlight coming in. And then I'm doing the exact same thing with the multiply layer with kind of a bluish color is going in and laying in the shadows, so I really get that nice contrast between the orangish yellow highlight and the purplish blue shadow, and kind of makes sure that I've got those colors near each other so they're playing off of each other really well. And so again, that's another thing you want to do is play your lights and your darks off of each other so that it becomes a more distinct type of look, so you can get that real contrast. And if you're doing it with the colors where you've got, you know, purplish blues for shadows and yellowish oranges for highlights, it really does make the colors pop. That's one of the things the Impressionists did a lot. But right now I'm just really kind of going around and putting all the different stuff on here for the picture to make sure any last minute details that I want, and see if there's anything that I wanted to change and push back, like some of these grasses and that kind of stuff. So it really gives that feeling of him sitting in the grass, and looking for any little artifacts or anything that I may have left or missed, like up on his nose. I fixed that in a second. There's one thing there. There it goes. We're fixing that. And so just kind of doing all that. So that, again, you know, start loose, start with each layer, build it up, and then work your way towards your highlights and your shadows, and just kind of take your time doing it. So I hope this helped. Again, if you liked it, if you got a lot out of it, make sure to subscribe, share the channel, and give it a thumbs up, because all of it really helps. Thanks for watching.